So anyway, Robbie wanted to come over, and he's here, and we're glad to have him. The book, Initial Hospitality, Ireland, Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution, is here on sale. But I was just telling Robbie, I think most people here have brought their own copy because they've already been reading it, and hopefully they can get it signed. So to show Tarly Marcus Day on Carraige, Féile Carraige is a festival that we organise every October, and the Strablin she the Féile, Politiac Parchahis, August Pobble, community participation in politics. So basically what we're about doing is creating spaces to have this type of debate and this type of event that we're having here today. We've been talking about from the outset when we opened the building here about creating republics of the mind, so the space to think about how we can use our agency to change the community around us. And this is very much, this talk today is part of a series that we have on called Exulu Ur Nua, Imagining a New Ireland, because our argument is that these debates often take place at elite level and don't take place at grassroots level. So we always argue that our experience of activism and historiography is all the best stuff comes from the bottom up, and all the best stuff has to come from the bottom up if it's going to achieve anything. So all these debates have to happen at our level, and that's what we're trying to do with this event here today. And speaking to Bill yesterday, this has been a labour of love for himself and Robbie. They were at this for 5 years on the QT, telling nobody about it, sharing emails and giving each other late night phone calls, debating different chapters, and it's timely, and I'm glad that it's here. I wish it had been here when I was at Queen's, because we were getting fed all the shade of the day, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a wee while. Just over the last day, I've been reading some of the reviews. I'm ashamed I'm only on chapter 1. Orleano has me doing far too much hard work, so I don't get the time to read. But Chris Buzang has described this as one of the finest works of Irish and anti-imperialist historiography written to date. So a fine piece of praise there. Fergal McCluskey has said, he's with us here today, that this book remorselessly delves into the abattoir of Irish history, and he says that it tears the liberal perspective to shreds. So that's what we want, to tear it to shreds. And we're going to hear more about that as we go here today. So, and Carraige a Vesagi Nagami, Rabbi Glorcha February J. Momacha, and Shintamaj Goy Oscar to Mark, which is core of his play, Magalore, in true Freudian style, but don't want to have a long lecture. So Rob is going to try and keep it Master Gunta, and what we're going to do then is just open it up for debate and discussion and just let people feed in. Now, what's Magalore, Rabbi? So, can I tell you, like the Gaelic Igravi Foster, August Gaelic Igravi Foster, and he said to me today, I'm coming to Balmorphy, I'm doing this in Gaelic or Burla. Well, you can use whatever I have, but I think that it's there. So while I'm a hand in you lads, Bull the bus all war, horse Robbie McVeigh.
Well, Tabby leave a heart, shouldn't get about Gaelic na Halaba. Initially, Tammy get about Kailche at their Gaelic na Halaba August Gaelic. So, but they get about Gaelic on. So, I suppose I wanted to put this in context. It's interesting that what you were saying about me and Bill and how we came to set about the project. It really felt like when we started talking about it, it was kind of, it was everybody was still in reconciliation mode, and the notion that you would do something about colonialism in Ireland was kind of like it was definitely a labour of love, but you felt that you were kind of swimming in the wrong direction. Of course, in the time in between, you've had the whole Black Lives Matter moment, and the way that has re-energised the discussion around this, not just in the States but everywhere else around the world. So it's incredible how much that has changed, and I'm very aware that hopefully the book has more immediate reference precisely because of that context. But it's a book that's not just about Ireland; it's about Ireland in the context of colonialism around the world, and how everybody is still trying to come to terms with that legacy. And I suppose one of the things that I've learnt from following BLM a wee bit is that you notice that very often in the States now and in Canada and Australia to some extent, there's an immediate acknowledgement of prior ownership of land. Like, when people, even when there are academic conferences, that people will stand up and they'll acknowledge that the land belonged to somebody else. And I think, when I see it, on the one hand, I was going that there's something very inspiring about it, but there's also something, I don't know whether it's just my Irish retentiveness or something. I can't completely go with that either, but I do think it's important that we learn from that. And I wanted absolutely to do what I'm doing today and to try and put that in that kind of context. So the introduction is really as a way of thinking about what that means for me in an Irish context. So it's you know, I was, you know, genuinely, truly honoured to be asked to do this. It's West Belfast is a place that I've had a long relationship with, and kind of in terms of my understanding of politics and human rights and justice, I owe this community an awful lot. So I wanted to put the introduction today in that kind of context. So. Well, you know, really what I'm asking is, if you were doing what they do and they now do routinely in America or Australia or Canada in this context, what would we do? Well, you know, on the one hand, there's an obvious reference to Ballymurrahu. Like you can kind of see who this land belonged to at one level. But I think much more for me, and particularly obviously in terms of the kind of community that's here today, that the language becomes the definitive key into that, the way you explore there's no place in this island you can go where the language doesn't provide a key into what that history is and how we try to come to terms with that. So I suppose in that sense, you start with the language, you start with the place names, you start, and I don't just mean in the sense of Belfast, but in Carraige and Shaw, Ballymurphy, all the local names that give you an access into the history of place. You obviously then have to do it in terms of the history going right back. You know, there's quite a detailed account of the Chichesters still honoured in the centre of the city, and how when Arthur Chichester arrived, they rode out along the loch, just butchering people as they went along. So that history has to be in there as well if we're trying to put ourselves in the context of our colonial history. There's the question of Engorda Moor. What happened here during Engorda Moor? How much memory is there of that? How much do people know? I know there's a lot of historians here today, but have we really dug into that sense of what we're carrying? Then on top of that, you know, obviously the more recent stuff that was clearly defined by a colonial relationship, the Spring Hill Massacre, Ballymurphy Massacre, all the other deaths that were associated with the recent conflict. So all that stuff would have to be in the process of doing what they do post BLM in the States or Canada or Australia. But there's also the personal relationships that we're talking about as well. And I have to acknowledge that my own debt, but Des Wilson and Noel were great friends to me, had a huge influence on me, and also obviously in the community that's still alive here, in the sense of the whole project that you're trying to carry forward here. A really important grassroots discussion of analysis of what education could do for a community in struggle, a people in struggle. So that has to be acknowledged as well. But the other thing that would kind of just puts everything else in context, I think, is that I don't know where I got this from. It could have been from Noel or Des, or it could have been from Kieran DeBarry's book. But there's that story about whenever the estate was built. It was designed specifically to be too small, to put in the shittiest conditions in terms of the quality of the housing material. But the one thing that was of high quality was the topsoil in the estate, and the topsoil was removed from Ballymurphy and taken over to East Belfast. And if you want a metaphor for what is wrong with this state, for why you shouldn't celebrate 100 years of the history of this state, it's there in that one kind of simple, pathetic act, if you like, that you wouldn't leave them the one thing that might have been useful to this community. So that's me setting it in context, and I know that's a bit drawn out, but I do think it's important for us to try and find ways of doing that, and I think there's no better place to try and to try and do that. Then in terms of the book itself, what does it try and do? Well, I suppose there's three key elements in it. The first is a history, because there's obviously an ongoing discussion around what does it mean to ask the question of how Ireland was colonised. Some people would suggest that Ireland wasn't colonised at all. Something else happened. So you need a history that both addresses the factual story of what the colonial process was in Ireland, but also puts that in the wider context of, it becomes much easier to understand some of that stuff if you look at what happened in other places. So people engage with the question of plantation here and what it actually means. But of course, it was repeated in North America, and even in that simple comparative context, that provides you with a way into understanding the history and the nature of colonisation. I suppose the other, just by way of encouraging discussion, I think one of the key lessons that I personally learned from that is that if you want to understand empire, if you want to understand colonialism, at its very essence, the best and the simplest way to understand it is when it acts in concert. So it's not when the English are doing something to the Irish, the French are doing something to the Africans, or the Dutch are doing something to the Indonesians. It's when the empires actually act in concert to do something to the rest of the world. That starts with Portugal and Spain dividing up the whole world between themselves, supported by the papacy, obviously. And when you divide up the whole world between two countries, and then it happens in a classic form in the Berlin Conference in the middle of the 19th century, when all these European countries divide up the whole of Africa. There's not one African person at that conference, and yet these countries decide they can divide up a continent. And it happens at the start of the 20th century then, when an 8-nation army invades China and imposes a new regime on the Chinese people. So it's that notion of working in concert that is at the very heart of the empire that we want to unpack and challenge in this. The second section of the book then addresses the two states that emerged from the colonisation, where you begin to see what you're dealing with in terms of the present from the point of partition onwards. So there's quite a detailed analysis of the way that both those of the way that partition happened, and also the form that those two states took. You're probably, especially here, people are all too aware of the kind of character of the six-county state, but I think it's maybe more interesting in terms of beginning to unpack some of the contradictions of the 26-county state. And I think one of the most important concepts that we mobilise to do that is this notion of white dominion. And what that means is whenever partition was forced in Ireland, after, as we all know, the 1918 general election, there'd been a clear democratic vote for a republic, independent republic. Once partition was forced on it, we kind of know the model that developed in the north, this integration of the six counties into the United Kingdom as it was. But in the south, the model that was provided was one that was still with an empire. It was not we know it wasn't a republic, but it wasn't even a free state in that sense. It was a construction that was allocated a space that was defined by this notion of white dominion. What does that mean? It means that Ireland, or the 26 counties, was supposed to join this list of former colonies which now could have a level of independence that were defined by their whiteness. So they impose a racial identity on Ireland, and more particularly on the 26 counties, which didn't exist at that time. So if you're trying to make sense of some of the dynamics of contemporary racism in Ireland, that is a key moment. What the British Empire is saying is, well, you can have a level of autonomy, but you do it as a white dominion, not as a republic. So it's incredibly, I would argue, it's incredibly important for then understanding the way that state developed, the kind of character of the state, and the politics within it. So that's a very brief overview of the trajectory of the two states. On the one hand, you then get a gradual movement towards a form of independence in the 26 counties, but all done obviously in the context of a partitioned island. In the north, a polity that actually genuinely compares to apartheid South Africa. And Rhodesia, it's where you actually see a reaction, a genuine reaction from a history that looked as if it was moving towards a moment of liberation and self-determination. So both states inherently problematic, both states defined by empire, albeit in very different ways, and that then brings us to the third section of the book, which is really asking, well, what do we do about this, and where does this? How do we make sense of this in terms of contemporary Ireland? And I suppose, the other thing I wanted to stress, that thing in terms of white dominion. It's a core point, is that some of those countries that you'll know are Australia and Canada and New Zealand, and it's kind of why they might be constructed as a white dominion is fairly obvious, in the sense that you had large white settler majorities, but the one that gives to the nature of those white dominions is South Africa, because South Africa, of course, had a overwhelming black majority, and yet it was still provided with a status with empire that said you can be a white dominion. So that it was nothing to do with democracy. It was saying that there's enough white people essentially to justify autonomy within empire. So that's the middle section of the book, which addresses the nature of the two states. The final section of the book turns to the question of self-determination, anti-imperialism, the politics that might begin to resist some of this history. And of course, it again situates the history of Irish anti-imperialism in terms of the wider context. And I suppose, again, just to give you a flavour of some of the arguments that we make, I think for me, probably the most striking contribution that we make is in terms of a wider notion of anti-imperialism that comes out of Ireland is, well, there's two actually. The first is the United Irish Movement. What's striking about the United Irish Movement is they emerge from the French Revolution, and they emerge in tandem with some of the more progressive politics of the American Revolution. But they go a whole stage further in terms of imagining a new population in which the differences that have been fomented by colonialism between people being Protestant, Catholic and dissenter, between native and settler, are reimagined in the form of as Tom put it, the common name of Irish person. So it's an incredibly important moment, not just for Ireland, but in terms of anti-imperialism, that you think of a citizenship which transcends the divisions and differences that have been posed on people by colonialism and imperialism. And it's a very early moment for that to happen, which is, as I say, is of world significance, and we have to be, I think, very proud of that. And then the second one, which is in some ways more, I suppose, a darker truth, if you like, is the Terence McSweeney truth, that it's not those who can inflict the most, but those who can suffer the most who will triumph in the end. And I think that's a really important analysis, but it's also an analysis that shouldn't be trivialized. But again, I mean, this is why I was saying at the start that I think we have to put these kind of analyses in the context of local experience. You can't understand where the contemporary Turf Lodge or Ballymurphy or the White Rock is without looking at putting that in the context of Spring Hill and Ballymurphy. So people have suffered a huge amount, but it's not something to be celebrated. It's just the truth that we were never going to go away. The community was never going to go away. So it's as I say, it's a truth, but it's not a truth that you want to trivialize or simplify in any way. So where does all that leave us in terms of contemporary Ireland. We can have it's interesting times, like in terms of what's happening, and I'm really keen to hear from the floor where people, how upbeat or otherwise people are in terms of Irish futures. But I think I suppose I'd like to leave you with one bit of the book that's kind of quite interesting and different and maybe challenging for people, and this is the way that we mobilise this concept of Mestiyahi, which is it's a Spanish term, and essentially it was used to describe the mixture of people that emerged from colonialism, so a mixture of white settlers and indigenous people, and enslaved Africans who were taken to colonies. So it's that complex mixture that only colonialism creates. And I suppose the easiest way to understand it, as I would use it, is it's the very opposite of that term miscegenation. That miscegenation suggests there's something really bad, it's a racist construct. There's something really terrible about race mixing. This is the opposite. It's saying that there's something, for all the evils and the negativity of colonialism, there's something really positive that comes out of colonialism and responses to it. So we use that term in a general sense to begin to describe some of the complexity of the political and cultural forms that come out of colonialism. In Ireland, it's the simplest way to understand it, for me anyway, is that notion of the macaronic song tradition, that you have, songs where one line is sung in Irish and one line is sung in English. It's also there in the whole notion of breck or speckled. The people, if you don't want to allocate people in terms of colour, the notion of speckledness describes some of the complexity of our identity, which is is a mixture of being settlers and being natives. It's a mixture of being Protestant and Catholic and so on. It's an incredibly complex mix, but the mix itself becomes something that you can celebrate in the way that the United Irish Movement did, rather than seeing as a negative thing. So I suppose for me the most important thing to emphasise about that is that what I'm saying about it is that it's about complexity, not about simplicity. So in language terms, it's about bilingualism, not monolingualism. Like where we have to celebrate the fact that you're creating a bilingual communities here, but it's not. They're not monolingual English communities. They're not monolingual Irish communities, but they're communities which are confident or relaxed in both languages. And there's something really quite remarkable about that project. So I'm under pressure from my kids. I've engaged with both the politics and the culture of kneecap, and I find it really fascinating. I think really inspiring, and really important symbol of of what Mestiyahi would mean to me. But again, the point is that if you really want to understand what that's about, you have to speak Irish and English. You can't speak a little bit of both. So if you're serious about it, people have to take the challenge really positively. But if they do it, it makes for a richer, more interesting Ireland, in which you genuinely begin to move us towards some sort of self-determination. So that's a kind of brief overview of some of the key themes. But just to give a sense of what I mean by that, it's kind of I suppose I would say it's Shinner Nialtas, the Changa Bio or Boiste. That's the important thing. That the language is absolutely central to that process. It's a challenging thing, but it's also the key symbol of the fact that people haven't been defeated, that people have imagined a different future, which you're all part of. So hopefully that'll get us going a wee bit. Anyway.